In early January 2026, the story of Venezuela stopped being only a domestic crisis and became, again, an imperial problem. Not because Venezuela changed suddenly. It was because the same structural pattern that is repeated across empires and resource states reached a point where outside powers decided the positives of waiting were higher than the negatives of acting. Venezuela owns the largest proven crude oil reserves on Earth. The number is so large it sounds theoretical, roughly 303 billion barrels, often cited as around 17% of the global total. But that geological fact has never guaranteed national strength. In modern history, it has often done the opposite. It has created a political economy that can survive without building a broad tax base, without maintaining productive institutions, and without keeping legitimacy through performance. It can rule by distributing rents instead. That is the first mechanism you have to understand if you want to understand what is happening now. A state that lives on rents does not need citizens in the same way a taxed state does. When a government collects most of its money by taxing millions of people, it has to keep the economy breathing. It needs commerce. It needs payroll. It needs the private sector to function. It also has to negotiate, because when citizens pay, they demand. But when a government collects most of its money by selling a resource abroad, it can bypass that bargain. It can fund itself with foreign currency while keeping domestic politics insulated from domestic productivity. In the short run, that can look like stability. In the long run, it usually becomes a trap, because it turns the state into a machine that is optimized to control distribution, not to grow production. When prices are high, the machine feels powerful. When prices fall, the machine does not adapt. It tightens. It centralizes. It searches for enemies. It prints. It confiscates. It borrows. It hollows out the very capacity it needs to recover. Venezuela is not the only country to learn this lesson. Spain learned it when silver from the Americas became the engine of the crown. Rome learned it when conquest tribute replaced civic contribution. The Dutch learned it when financial dominance outpaced real productive advantage. Britain learned it when imperial commitments grew larger than the industrial base that once funded them. The pattern is consistent. When a system becomes dependent on external inflows that are not earned through broad domestic productivity, politics becomes a fight over allocation. The economy becomes a secondary concern, and legitimacy becomes something you enforce rather than something you generate. Venezuela's modern version of this began way before the latest headlines. Oil made the state big. Oil made the state central. Oil turned the public sector into the main ladder of social mobility and the main dispenser of patronage. It also created a dangerous illusion that national prosperity was a matter of controlling the oil spigot, not of building a diversified system that could survive if the spigot narrowed. When that illusion meets institutional decay, the collapse is not dramatic at first. It is administrative. It is technical. It is a slow loss of capacity that only becomes visible in numbers later, and in everyday life sooner. The oil industry is not just a well in the ground. It is engineers, pipelines, refineries, spare parts, accounting systems, shipping insurance, blending components, and access to capital. Venezuela's crude is often extra heavy, and that technical reality raises the cost of producing it and the complexity of exporting it. So when the state politicizes the industry, purges expertise, underinvests in maintenance, and drives away partners, production does not merely decline, it can collapse. That happened in Venezuela. Output that once exceeded 3 million barrels per day in the late 20th century fell to a fraction of that. Recent reporting notes the country struggling to produce even around 1 million barrels per day, a startling gap between reserves and capacity. And once production falls, everything else becomes harder, because the rentier state has fewer rents to distribute. The politics does not become gentler, it becomes more desperate. This is where the second mechanism appears. When real revenue fails, the system replaces it with claims. In many empires, this begins as borrowing. It continues as monetary expansion. It ends as a credibility crisis. Venezuela's hyperinflation was not simply bad policy. It was the financial signature of a rentier state trying to maintain obligations without the underlying flow of real value. The numbers became absurd, millions of percent in the peak years by IMF estimates and other compilations. But the meaning was simple. The state was manufacturing nominal currency to replace real resources it could no longer produce or obtain. When credibility breaks, the economy becomes survivalist. People dollarize informally. Markets move to shadows. The state loses informational control. Corruption becomes not just a moral failure, but an operational necessity for basic transactions. At that point, the political system rarely reforms itself through persuasion. It relies on coercion and gatekeeping. It controls access to dollars, access to jobs, access to imports, access to permits. It makes loyalty the currency that substitutes for a functioning market. This is not unique to Venezuela. It is a late-stage pattern in many centralized systems that lose productive capacity. The outward ideology can differ, and the internal mechanics converge. Now add the third mechanism, external constraint. When a rentier state breaks credibility internally, it often becomes dependent on external lifelines. Buyers willing to accept discounted resources, lenders willing to take political risk, allies willing to provide security services, and networks willing to move goods through sanctions and restrictions. Over time, that dependence reshapes the state. It stops acting like a sovereign national institution and starts acting like a coalition that manages survival by trading pieces of the economy to whoever can keep it afloat. This is the stage where international politics stops being about values and becomes about leverage. The United States sanctioned Venezuela's oil sector over years, and those sanctions significantly constrained the country's economic options, while also adding pressure to an already damaged system. The exact moral evaluation of sanctions is debated, but their structural effect is not mysterious. They reduce legal access to markets and capital, forcing trade into narrower channels, often at discounts, often through intermediaries, often with higher corruption and higher transaction costs. Meanwhile, Venezuela accumulated massive defaulted and disputed obligations. Analysts cited by Reuters estimate roughly $60 billion in defaulted bonds, with broader external debt, including PDVSA obligations, bilateral loans, and arbitration awards, somewhere in the $150 to $170 billion range, depending on accounting for interest and judgments. That matters because, in a crisis, debt is not just a financial number. It is a queue of claimants waiting to seize assets, revenues, and future policy. This is where you can see the empire pattern clearly. As empires strain, they tend to turn future streams into present stability. They borrow against tomorrow to avoid making painful adjustments today. They mortgage capacity. In Venezuela, that mortgaging took multiple forms: oil for loans arrangements, discounted sales, and the slow entanglement of its oil infrastructure with external political bargains. In that kind of system, sovereignty becomes negotiable in practice, even when it remains absolute in rhetoric. And then, in January 2026, the situation took a decisive turn. Multiple major outlets and analysis institutions describe a U.S. military operation in Caracas on January 3, 2026, followed by the capture of Nicolás Maduro and the emergence of a U.S.-backed interim arrangement. Reuters and AP, reporting in early January 2026, further described the U.S. moving to oversee Venezuelan oil sales and to structure control over revenues held in U.S. accounts. The details matter less here than the underlying logic. When a country with critical resources enters a prolonged legitimacy and capacity crisis, outside powers do not merely watch, they calculate. They calculate migration patterns. They calculate regional instability. They calculate the integrity of sanctions regimes. They calculate organized crime and trafficking networks. They calculate energy supply. They calculate geopolitical enemies. And when the internal state can no longer credibly manage those variables, external actors will attempt to manage them instead, either through diplomacy, financial pressure, covert action, or, in rare moments, overt force. The official framing in early January 2026 is that Washington intends to run aspects of Venezuela's economic recovery and oil commercialization, with proceeds protected for stabilization and reconstruction. This includes steps to prevent creditors and courts from seizing oil revenues held in U.S. Treasury accounts, precisely because those revenues represent the only meaningful pool of funds that can anchor a new settlement. That move reveals something most people miss. In late-stage crises, control of revenue streams is control of the state. In theory, governments rule through laws. In practice, they rule through payrolls, contracts, fuel, and food. Whoever controls the flow of hard currency and the ability to import essentials controls the equilibrium. This is why oil becomes central again and again, not as an industry, but as the fiscal spine of the political order. It is also why external actors focus on oil sales, escrow accounts, and the legal architecture around them before they focus on elections, speeches, or constitutions. Because without revenue control, nothing else holds. But there is a complication. Venezuela's oil revenue is not a blank slate. It is already claimed. Companies like ConocoPhillips and others have long-standing claims tied to nationalizations and arbitration awards, and Reuters reporting notes how these creditor dynamics collide with any attempt to use oil money for rebuilding rather than repayment. So the U.S. response has been to legally shield certain pools of revenue from seizure, arguing that allowing creditors to capture the funds would undermine stabilization. This is not unprecedented. Empires and occupying powers have often tried to ring-fence revenue in crisis zones, creating protected flows meant to fund reconstruction while postponing creditor claims. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it creates a new class of grievance that later explodes. Now step back from the legal mechanics and look at the deeper historical pattern Venezuela is sitting inside. There is a repeating sequence across empires and petrostates. First, a windfall creates a political economy of distribution. Second, institutions become dependent on the windfall and stop investing in broad productivity. Third, when the windfall weakens through price, capacity, sanctions, or mismanagement, the system replaces real income with coercion, monetary expansion, and debt. Fourth, the crisis becomes international because external actors are tied to the flows: energy, migration, debt, and security. Fifth, the resolution is not a clean transition. It is a renegotiation of claims. Who gets paid? Who gets amnesty? Who controls the resource? Who controls the border? Who controls the currency? That is why the question, what happens next in Venezuela, is not really a question about one single leader. It's about settlement. Settlements have a structure. They tend to include 4 pillars. 1. The internal security apparatus needs a deal, or it becomes the spoiler. 2. The revenue stream needs to be stabilized, or everything else collapses. 3. External creditors and claimants need a path, not necessarily full payment, but a credible sequence. 4. Ordinary people need a measurable improvement in lived conditions, or legitimacy never returns. In early January 2026, there are visible signs of a settlement attempt. One is the emphasis on oil commercialization under U.S. supervision and the talk of long-term oversight of sales. The other is the reported use of oil transfers in the range of tens of millions of barrels as a bargaining tool in recent arrangements. Another is prisoner releases described by human rights groups and Reuters as gestures amid upheaval and negotiation. Even the discussion of reopening IMF and World Bank engagement, including mention of Venezuela's frozen SDRs, fits the same structure: external liquidity, controlled release, conditional reintegration. These are not moral gestures. They are components of an engineered equilibrium. To really understand Venezuela, you need to connect it to other historical cases where a strategic resource became both the source of state power and the seed of state fall. Let's look at Iran after the revolution, under sanctions pressure and oil dependence. The state learned to survive through rationing, enforcement, and external networks. Over time, a sanctions economy became its own ecosystem, with actors who benefited from scarcity and opacity. That makes reform harder because the crisis itself becomes profitable for insiders. Look at Iraq after the Gulf War and then after 2003. The central struggle was never simply democracy versus dictatorship. It was control of oil revenue, control of contracts, control of the security apparatus, and the question of whether the state could become a taxed, productive system rather than a rent distribution machine. Look at Nigeria, where oil revenues repeatedly enabled patronage politics, while undercutting manufacturing competitiveness through currency effects and rent seeking. Different ideologies, different cultures, same structural gravity. Resource rents concentrate power, and concentrated power tends to defend itself, even when it is destroying the productive base. Venezuela's tragedy is that its oil wealth was so immense that it could postpone reality longer than many states can. It could run deficits, it could import consumption, it could paper over institutional decay. It could, for a time, look like it was choosing. But inevitably, geology meets math. When production capacity fails, when sanctions narrow markets, when debt claims stack up, when currency credibility breaks, the state cannot distribute enough to keep loyalty stable. And when a rentier state can no longer pay the coalition that sustains it, it fragments, bargains, and invites external intervention, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through desperation, sometimes by accident. This is the point where many audiences misunderstand what they're seeing. They see dramatic events, raids, arrests, executive orders, interim leaders, negotiations with oil majors, and they assume the story is about personalities. It isn't. Personalities matter only because they sit on top of the distribution machine. The machine is the story. That machine now has to be rebuilt in a way that can actually function without permanent emergency measures. That brings us to the modern parallel, not because the United States is Venezuela, but because the United States, like every mature power, faces its own version of the same temptation, substituting production claims. Empires rarely fall because they run out of money. They fall because the composition of their economy switches. When a society's best talent, incentives, and political energy flow into controlling assets and extracting rents instead of building productive capacity, it becomes weak. It can look wealthy, with rising asset prices, financial sophistication, and global leverage, while the underlying productive base is straining. That's how late-stage imperial systems behave. They defend returns through financial engineering rather than expanding output. They become more sensitive to confidence. They become more reliant on external flows. For the US, the key external flow is not a single commodity. It is the demand for dollar assets, the ability to fund deficits, sustain global commitments, and absorb shocks because the rest of the world parks savings in US instruments. That system is powerful. But it also creates the same temptation that oil created for Venezuela. The temptation to believe the external inflow will always be there. In Venezuela, the inflow was oil rent. In the United States, the inflow is global capital seeking safety and liquidity. Both are forms of privilege, and privilege, if treated as permanent, becomes misallocation. The deeper warning from Venezuela is not "don't nationalize," or "don't sanction," or "don't vote for this leader." The warning is structural. If you build a state that does not need broad domestic production to fund itself, you will eventually produce politics that do not prioritize broad domestic production. And then, when the inflow shrinks or becomes conditional, you will discover that the institutions you neglected cannot be rebuilt overnight. That is why Venezuela's recovery cannot be reduced to restarting oil wells. Even if investment comes back, even if production rises, even if sanctions ease, the country still has to rebuild institutional trust. Courts, contracts, property rights, fiscal systems, and basic administrative competence. And here, the current situation creates a paradox. On one hand, a US-managed oil revenue framework could temporarily stabilize the big picture, limit elite looting, and ensure imports and infrastructure budgets are funded. On the other hand, if Venezuelans see the system as an outside trusteeship designed primarily to turn oil value outward or to make external claimants a priority, it might provoke resistance and delegitimize whoever is installed to administer it. History is packed with these contradictions. When Britain took over Egyptian finances in the 19th century, it stabilized debt repayment and regained certain fiscal functions. But it also created nationalist resentment that later reshaped the region. When the United States rebuilt parts of Europe after World War II through the Marshall Plan, it worked largely because local institutions retained legitimacy and because the aid aligned with rebuilding productive capacity, not just extraction. When outside powers manage revenues without building legitimate institutions, they can create a weak order that fails the moment the external attention leaves. So the most realistic way to understand Venezuela's near future is not as a straight line toward democracy or dictatorship, or prosperity or collapse. It is as a contested settlement over a resource stream, a settlement where every actor has leverage points. Domestic political coalitions have the leverage of disruption. Security forces have the leverage of violence. External creditors have the leverage of courts and asset seizures. External states have the leverage of sanctions, recognition, and access to capital. And ordinary people have the leverage of migration, protest, and compliance. Which sounds weak, until you remember that the state cannot function if the population refuses to cooperate with daily logistics. That is why prisoner releases, oil escrow orders, and sanction adjustments are not side stories. They are the early components of a new bargaining framework. But the late-stage consequences remain, and they tend to arrive regardless of who wins the first round of negotiations. One consequence is the reconstruction trap. Rebuilding oil capacity can take years and enormous capital, and in Venezuela's case, experts cite figures in the tens of billions to restore infrastructure meaningfully. That time lag means political patience will be tested long before benefits fully appear. Another consequence is the creditor trap. If too much revenue is promised outward, domestic legitimacy collapses. If too little is promised outward, investment and reintegration stall. The country can get stuck in a halfway state, where it is neither sovereignly reformed nor externally trusted. Another consequence is the institutional trap. If the settlement is built on emergency control rather than credible domestic institutions, the system becomes dependent on continued external enforcement. And another consequence is the narrative trap. Every faction will tell a story that turns structural trade-offs into moral absolutes, making compromise look like betrayal. Empires fail when they cannot compromise, because every compromise threatens the coalition that holds power. Venezuela has lived in that zone for years. The recent situation is not the start of the crisis. It is the moment the crisis became an international reallocation problem. And if you want the most grounded conclusion, it is this. Venezuela is a case study in how resource wealth can create a state that grows strong without becoming resilient. It can be distributed without building. It can enforce without convincing. It can take credibility until the bill comes. When that bill arrives, it is paid in pieces. First, the currency, then the institutions, then by the population, finally by sovereignty itself, as external actors move in to stabilize the flows they cannot afford to lose. That is the imperial logic underneath the headlines. Not ideology, personality, or even morality. Structure. And once you know how to see structure, you start seeing why the same pattern repeats across centuries. Rome's tribute, Spain's silver, Britain's financial empire, modern petrostates, and the reserve systems of today. Different symbols, same mechanics. If you want to keep tracking how these systems evolve, how settlements are built, how revenue control becomes political control, and how late-stage empires manage decline without admitting it, subscribe to the channel. Not for predictions, for clarity about the stages and what's to come next when the numbers finally stop working.